wants those people to be on this board. And he asked them to. That's quite common. It's not in the design I gave you. But there's nothing cast in concrete. You do whatever you have to make the board effective, keeping to the basic principle that everybody over whom he has authority must have authority over him through the board. The other thing that happens is, in a decentralized company, as I mentioned, he may have external stakeholders here, customer representatives, supplier representatives, advertising agencies, bankers on the board as well. He treats this like a corporate board. So there are all kinds of variations possible. There are no rules that say you have to do it this way. The only thing you have to do if you're going to keep this system effective is give everybody an opportunity to participate in decisions that directly affect them. That's the critical requirement. Yeah.
Once instituted, has there been any instance of abandonment?
No, I don't know of a single one. I should explain, this was published for the first time about 10 years ago now. I keep running across organizations that are using it that took it out of the book. We have probably installed it in 50 or 60 organizations of a wide variety of types in a number of different countries. I have had no direct experience with any company that installed it that later withdrew it. Now, I can't speak for others. All the cases I've heard of independently have been effective.
Can you have an outside member on a board that's maybe 4 or 5 levels down in the organization?
If it's useful for you, you sure can. I mean, you make the rule. For example, when we did the first one, we said the top manager ought to be the chairman of that board, right? It makes sense. Do you know that almost every single board that we've established over 10 years has rejected that idea? Guess what they do? They rotate the chairmanship, almost invariably. It's fine if that's what they want to do.
We seem to, in the federal government, have this paranoia almost about holding people accountable or responsible. Do you run into the argument that everyone's accountable, therefore no one is accountable?
No, you haven't changed the accountability of the manager at all. You haven't reduced his task of managing. You've just changed the way the policies and plans are prepared to make sure that they're better coordinated and integrated. But you haven't reduced it. Let me tell you what the fundamental problem is associated with this. And we may want to explore this afternoon. What you do here is you reduce the power that any manager has over his subordinates. No question about that. Okay? But you increase his power to accomplish what he wants to. See, there are two kinds of power. Power over and power to. And what most people don't realize is they're inversely related. As one increases, the other decreases. Let me point out what I mean. The most powerful man on earth up to a few years ago was the Shah of Iran. He was subject to less constraint than any other ruler in the world. He could do just about any damn thing he wanted to. I had one occasion to meet with the royalty of Iran shortly before the revolution. And the entire meeting was devoted to his complaints about the fact that he couldn't implement a single goddamn policy. He said they mess it up every time down below. Now, he could have hung, killed, or done anything he wanted to any of those people without any trial, any court, or anything. Had infinite power over them, but he couldn't get it done. On the other hand, the President of the United States doesn't have any power over me. The President of the University got no power over me. He can't fire me. Doesn't control what I teach, how I teach it, or anything. But he can get a lot of things done that he wants to get done because I approve of him. And I'll work with him to get done what he wants. Okay? This involves a conversion of the concept of management from the concept of command to the concept of leadership, and they are fundamentally different. This is the radical transformation that's required. Managers have to develop capacity to lead rather than to command. Why? Because it's more effective with an intelligent group of subordinates. When you had a group of illiterates, functional illiterates under you, that may have not been the case. Now, also let me point out that in time of emergency, you've got another situation. Nobody says that if you're walking across the street and about to be hit by a truck, and you call a board meeting to decide what to do. You jump. But part of your planning and policy is the preparation for reactions during emergency. And they may involve one man takes command at that point, or else you're going to screw it up. But that's a collective decision. So it's not that you eliminate the use of authority under appropriate circumstances, it's that in general authority is exercised through leadership, not through command. Any other questions? Yeah.
How do you handle the problem of board discipline, time discipline, and conference leadership? In other words, the methodology by which the board work in an efficient manner, time efficient, or...
This is varied. The boards make their own rules, but I can tell you the most successful ones is clear. Boards are most successful work by consensus. Now, consensus is very different than agreement. Let me explain the difference. We had a meeting recently of a corporate board in which each member was asked to consider a certain problem. And they all came up with different solutions. Each solution was presented. They reached absolutely no agreement as to which solution was best. In fact, each one thought his solution was the best, but they were all different. I was present at this meeting, and the conversation went on for 2 hours. I broke in at that point and said, look, I would like to offer you the following choice. Tell me what you would do. You can either keep what you got now, we won't make any changes, or you will allow me to pick one of these 8 at random. Which will you do? It was unanimous to allow me to pick one at random. That's consensus without agreement. See? They agreed that any of these alternatives is better than that. But they didn't agree on which one was. Now, these groups ought to operate on consensus. They don't have to agree that this particular proposal is the best thing that could be done. They have to agree it's better to do this than what we have been doing. Now, you don't always generate consensus. Then what do? When you can't generate consensus, you design a test of the alternatives, and you get consensus on the fairness of the test. It's that double procedure which is the most effective that I've seen. By the way, that's all written up. There's a procedure for going through that process of getting a fair test and so on. I've even had to design it on the issue of capital punishment, where I could not get consensus on whether there ought to be capital punishment or not in a government. We designed a test in which both sides agreed. And the interesting thing was we did it without killing anybody. Any other question? We're just about ready for lunch, so let's have it.
That's where they gave me that.
It's conventional in delivery of a sermon to begin with a parable. And since a certain portion of this afternoon is going to be a sermon, it seems appropriate to begin with a parable. This happens to be one that I first heard in Mexico for reasons that will be apparent to you. The parable is about 3 sailors who were on a merchant marine that wrecked off the coast of Mexico a ways. They managed to survive by getting on a raft and floating to a deserted island that nevertheless had enough resources so they could sustain themselves. They were a Russian, an American, and a Mexican. They spent all their time sitting on the beach trying to spy a passing vessel in the hope that they could get saved. And while they were sitting on the beach one day, they saw a small object coming through the surf towards them, and they rushed into the surf to catch it, whatever it was. And as it got within reach, they grabbed it, pulled it out of the water, and it was a very dark, smoky brown bottle, tightly corked. So they hauled it ashore, and they had to improvise by breaking shells. They eventually pried the cork loose and popped it out, and out of the bottle appeared a beautiful young genie. She told them that they were each entitled to a wish, but they'd have to make them very quickly because she had a hell of a schedule and she had to get on to the next stop. And before she finished the sentence, the Russian said, "I wish I were at the Bolshoi with my wife watching the ballet." Like that, he disappeared. He had no sooner finished, the American said, "I wish I were at the Plaza Hotel with my girlfriend having a dining and dancing evening." Like that, he disappeared. But the Mexican sat there on the sand, didn't say a word. She stood there tapping her foot. Finally, she said, "I'm sorry, I can't wait any longer. You either give me your wish right now or I have to leave." And he looked up and took a big sigh and he said, "I miss those two guys. I wish they were back." We're going to have something to say about planning, hence the parallel. Management is an incredible phenomenon. We want to look at management now through the evolutionary process we've been going at. And by the way, in this area, it doesn't make any difference whether we talk about Navy, government, corporations, universities, or whatnot. It's completely general. There's a tremendous variety of ways in which people manage. Almost as much variety among managers as there is in color. No, there are an infinite number of colors. But you also know something about color that's important, namely that all color reduces to three elementary colors: red, blue, and yellow. The infinite variety simply comes about by various mixtures of the three basic pigments. Well, it turns out management is exactly the same. There are three fundamental types of management which appear in different mixtures in an individual and organization over time that make up all the variety. And moreover, in most organizations, one type of management dominates. So it becomes possible to look at an organization, say you're type A, B, or C, depending on the one that's the dominant one. But in any organization, you'll find them all to some degree. Now, with that proviso, if you keep thinking of them as primary numbers, I'm going to describe to you the pure forms. The thing that distinguishes between these basic types of management is their attitude towards time. Now, time is a very nice variable because it breaks into three parts: the past, the present, and the future. Attitudes, an even nicer variable because it breaks into two: favorable and unfavorable. Now, I have to apologize for what I'm about to do to you. I want to use a little mathematics, and I'm sorry. And if it throws any of you, let me know, and I'll try to do it in words. But I'd like to use a plus sign for a favorable attitude and a minus sign for an unfavorable one, and hope it causes no trouble. The first type of management is dissatisfied with the current state of affairs. That means it has a negative attitude towards the present. Furthermore, it doesn't like the way things are going. They're getting worse. What it likes is the way they used to be. Therefore, their primary objective is to recreate a previous state. And therefore, I'm going to call this reactive management. Its primary logic is described in their attitude towards change. They want to unmake change. Now let me make explicit what that means. The logic of this type of management goes as follows. I came into work today and I was confronted with a problem I didn't have yesterday. What the hell happened to cause that problem? Who's to blame? If I can find the cause of the problem and remove it, I'll be back to where I was. And that's fine. That's where I want to be. Now, when you put it that way, it doesn't sound very reactive, but it is. The primary objective is to go back to a previous state in which the problem didn't exist. This logic pervades our public life. In the 1920s, we developed a major social problem in the United States called alcoholism, right? We looked around and said, what's the blame for alcoholism? What was the answer? Alcohol. What do you do about it? Prohibit it. That's typically reactive. Get rid of it. And then we'll be back to where we were. It happened it didn't work, as you know. We didn't get rid of alcohol. And we got something else we hadn't bargained for called organized crime. But that didn't reduce our commitment to the method. In the 60s, when we began to develop a drug addiction problem in the United States, we looked around and said, what's the cause of that? Narcotics. So we illegalized them all. We're the only developed country in the world that did. And today we have the highest rate of addiction of any of the developed countries of the world. But nevertheless, we're committed. Perhaps the prime example of that commitment is in the way we treat crime. Crime is an undesirable social state. We look around and say, who's to blame for crime? The answer is the criminal. Therefore, get rid of him, imprison them. Despite the fact that all the data shows that crime is increasing despite imprisonment, and prison is a college of crime. So 80% of the people who go in will go in again, and they'll go in the second time for a worse crime than committed the first time because they learned how to do better crime while they were in there. So we produce a school for perpetuating crime through the reactive mode. Now, reactive management tends to romanticize and idealize the past and see the solutions to problems back there. Therefore, what it reveres is history. History reveals the solutions to problems. So it's not surprising that one of the favorite aphorisms of a reactive manager is, dash is the best teacher. What is it? Experience, right. Experience is the best teacher is a typical reactive aphorism. What's the best school to go to? Right. They're straight reactive concepts. It's for this reason that a reactive organization status is directly proportional to seniority. It's not surprising that the man at the top is referred to as the old man, right, because he generally is. As a matter of fact, studies have shown that on the average, he's 11 years older than his counterpart in other types of organizations. He does tend to be the old man. The enemy of this type of organization is change, because change is retrogressive. So they look out there and say, what's the primary driving force producing change in society? And what do you think their answer is? What's primarily responsible for all the change that's going on?
Necessity.
Hmm?
Necessity.
No. It's so obvious you're having trouble with it. Technology. Technology is the driving force of all the changes we're going through. And therefore, technology is the devil. Literally. If we look historically at reactive management, you can see the development of this very clearly. How many of you ever read Charles Snow's famous essay, The War of Two Cultures? Now, that was a famous set of lectures that Charles Snow, the British novelist and philosopher, gave at Cambridge many years ago, in which he described society as a war between the humanists on the one side and the scientists or technocrats on the other. The reactive manager is clearly on the side of the humanist, historically oriented, arguing against technology as an evil force in society. If you go back to the Industrial Revolution in England, as it got started, there was a major social movement in England called the Luddite movement. Any of you ever hear of the Luddites? Don't know it? That was a social movement involving a very large number of people who armed themselves with pickaxes, crowbars, and explosives. And they broke into factories and tried to blow them up and destroy them because they argued that the mechanization of production was destroying the quality of life. And they wanted to go back to handcraft guild production. Typical reactive movement. In the middle of the French Revolution, the principal intellectual leader who emerged was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a philosopher. who led what was called the Back to Nature movement. He tried to convince the French public that they ought to abandon the cities and the factories, go into the country, strip down and prance in a nude over the prairies whistling Bach. He painted the picture of the idyllic pastoral life, getting back to nature and restoring the quality of life. At the end of the 19th century in England, John Ruskin and William Morris led a movement called the Gothic Revival. And they literally built towns modeled after medieval communities in which they brought artisans and craftsmen and went back to medieval type production, produced some very great art in these communities, particularly industrial kind of art, but it was all individually made because they claimed that industrialized England was destroying the quality of life and the quality of art. In the United States in the 1960s, when the hippie movement was going, there was a large subgroup in the hippie movement that withdrew, formed communes, went up to British Columbia, bought land, and tried to do organic farming using no implements except their hands and feet. There's a marvelous record of one such group written by the son of one of the cult heroes of the 60s. Kurt Vonnegut was one of the real popular novelists of the kids in the 60s. And he had a son by the name of Mark, who was a member of one of these communes. And Mark came back and wrote a book called Return from Eden about one of these, an effort to go back to nature and escape the harshness and crassness of highly industrialized, technologically oriented life. During the 1960s, one of the most common pieces of graffiti around was a short expression which said, "God is dead." Do you remember that? Do you ever wonder where that came from? It came from a book written by a French mystic, Jacques Ellul, E-L-L-U-L. The book was called Technology. And "God is dead" is a phrase from a sentence. The whole sentence read as follows: God is dead. The devil reigns. And the devil is technology. That was the whole sentence. So the reactive sees technology as a threat and wants to get back to the eternal verities. It's science and engineering that's destroying things. All right, what does this kind of an organization look like? Well, first of all, it will be organized the way the oldest surviving form of human organization is organized. What's the oldest surviving form of human organization? Family, right. The family is the metaphor. This organization wants to be a great, big, happy family, right? That's one of the reasons the man at the top is also called the old man. First level of vice presidents are the oldest sons, then come the younger sons, and then comes the nephews and the first cousins, the second cousins, and so on down through the line. Loyalty and commitment to the welfare of the whole is absolutely essential. Above all other things, loyalty is required in such an organization. It's hierarchical and very, very highly centralized. Nothing happens without the approval of the patriarch, the old man. He's all-powerful in that system. Okay, that's a quick picture of what such an organization looks like. Let's take a look at how they plan. Well, first of all, this organization won't plan unless the old man approves of it, because nothing is done in this organization unless the old man approves. It's not always easy to convince him you ought to start planning. In fact, very few people did until perhaps 15 years ago when Columbia University had a brilliant idea of running an educational program exclusively for these old men. They did it, first of all, by calling it a senior executive development program. You had to be either an executive vice president or CEO to be admitted. So that immediately made them all want to go. But they're easy to identify. The easiest way of telling one of these programs is they always take place in the Bahamas. The second essential characteristic is the attendees are always male, because in reactive organizations you don't find females anywhere near the top except as secretaries. And they are required to bring their wives or a reasonable facsimile thereof. The final characteristic of these programs is that they are required strictly to attend classes for at least 2 hours a day. There is no real effort to overwhelm them or overcome them with education. But occasionally what happens is one of the entertainers they've hired to come in gets ill, conks out, and they have to get somebody quickly, and occasionally they get somebody who takes it seriously and tries to teach them something. And occasionally it happens that the person who they get tries to teach them something about planning. So what started to happen about 15, 20 years ago, occasionally these old men would come back after a week and feel they have to justify their vacation to their subordinates. So they would call a meeting. Now, the first thing about the old man is he never has a meeting with anybody except the oldest sons. So he calls in the senior vice presidents, and the meeting goes as follows. He says, "Boys," he said, "I just came back from that meeting, and I really learned something down there which justified the visit." He says, "We ought to start some corporate planning or some organizational planning." So I've decided we're going to prepare a 5-year plan, and I want it at the end of this year. He said, "Now this is what we're going to have to do." He said, "In order for me to have the corporate plan at the end of the year, I'm going to need a plan from each one of you in 11 months for your divisions. Is that clear?" And they say, "Yes, sir," click their heels, salute, and leave. And they call in the next level. And they say, "Boys, the old man wants a corporate plan in a year. It means I got to have a divisional plan in 11 months. So I need a plan from each of you for your department in 10 months. Is that clear?" And they say, "Yes, sir," click their heels, salute, and leave. And this process just keeps going down. And it keeps going down until they reach the indivisible part, the atom of the organization. This is Joe and his workforce. Now you can see what happens. If this is IBM or GE, you've got more levels than you got months. So they call Joe in to say, "Hey, Joe, the old man wants a corporate plan, and we got to start with you, so we need a plan for your section 6 months ago." Now, he's used to that kind of request. So the planning, although initiated from the top, will begin at the bottom. Okay? So the first thing to notice about reactive management is it engages in what's called bottom-up planning. As you'll see, the planning will migrate up from the bottom to the top. Now, what's the planning look like? Well, let's take a look. This is a reactive organization. So the first thing you do is make a list of all the things that are wrong with the present situation. These are called deficiencies. Well, it's easy. Anybody can sit down and make a list of all the things that are wrong. That's an easy step. The second step is harder. You design an effort to identify the cause of the deficiency and remove it. That's called a project. So we now have a project for each deficiency. So we have deficiency 1, deficiency 2, and so on, and we have project 1, project 2, and so on down the line. Next step, estimate the cost of the project. So we get a cost estimate for each project. Next step, estimate the benefit of the project. Then we combine the cost and the benefit, either the ratio, a difference, it depends on the measures used, to get a measure of performance. Net benefit. And now you can set priorities. Easily enough, you take the project with the highest performance measure, give it priority 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. He's now completed the first phase of planning. Second phase. He has to decide how much resources are going to be available to him for engaging in these projects. Now, the fact is he knows pretty well. Let's say he had $100,000 available to him last year. If it was a good year, he'll get 5 or 10% more this year. He knows that. If it was a bad year, he'll get 5 or 10% less. If it's a so-so year, he's going to get the same thing. That's not the problem. The problem is how much does he have to ask for to get that amount? Because you never get what you ask for. Now, if he's a smart manager, he will consult the literature, and extensive studies have been done on this, and we know what the average is in the American industry. I don't know what it is in the American military, but I suspect it isn't very much different. The appropriate multiplier is 2. So if he decides he wants 100,000, he starts off by saying, I'm going to ask for 200,000. That's the second phase. Third phase. He now picks priority project number 1 and looks at its cost. Let's say it's $50,000. He subtracts that from the 200,000 and leaves him 150,000. He takes priority project number 2 is 25,000. He subtracts that and he keeps working his way down the priority list until he's used the 200,000. He has 15 projects now. He now packages them. He produces a document which he brings these 15 projects together, defending them, making all sorts of promises about the rewards to be obtained by conducting them, and that's his plan, which he then submits to his immediate boss. All right, now what happens with his immediate boss? We've got to come back to this diagram. When it comes up to his immediate boss, that's this fellow up here, the second level. Now he's got 7 or 8 of these things submitted to him. He does 3 things. First, he has to establish his superiority to his subordinates. That's critical. And the way he does that is he corrects their spelling and grammar. The second thing he does is he adds his own projects because he has deficiencies at his level. He's going through the same process. So he now puts in projects of second level. Then he takes all of these together, repackages them, adds the appropriate safety factor, and submits it as his plan. And up this process goes through the ladder, all the way up. Eventually reaches here, and they put together a corporate plan or a departmental plan or an agency plan which consists of 150 or 200 projects with an allocation of resources to them and a statement of the expected benefits from each. About 25% of the corporate plans I've ever seen, and I've seen over 400 of them, are exactly of this form. And in government, it's about 50%. This type of planning is much more common in government than it is in industry, but it's not rare in industry. Before I look at this seriously with you to see what's wrong with it, I'd like to share an experience I had a couple years ago. I was at a conference in New York and ran into an old classmate of mine who had really made out. He was the CEO of one of the large electrical manufacturing companies in the United States. We hadn't seen each other for a long time. So we had a great reunion and lunch together, and I asked him what he was doing. He told me the kind of work he was doing in the company, and he asked me what I was doing. And he said, hey, he said, you're doing planning. He said, we got a planning meeting for the corporation coming up in a few weeks up in our hunting lodge that we own in Wisconsin. Would you like to come up and join us? And I said, did you say Wisconsin, a hunting lodge? He said, yeah. I said, I'll be there. So I joined them. I spent 3 days up there while the vice presidents reported in their packages in exactly the way I've just described to the executive committee of the corporation at the top, and they did a little honing and chiseling and sandpapering of the projects and changed a little bit, and they wound up at the end of 3 days with a corporate plan with 150 or 200 projects. I was very quiet during those 3 days. I was almost in awe of this process, and as a result, I was invited back the next year. So I was there the second year, and it was on the second day of the 3, I was having lunch with the CEO. He said to me, Russ, he said, you know, you never told me what you think of this process. I said, well, Buck, before I tell you what I think of it, what I really would like to do is ask you a couple questions. He said, go ahead. I said, okay, I was here last year and watched you go through this process. I've been here this year through a day and a half, and there hasn't been a single reference this year to last year's plan. I don't understand that. Oh, he said, that's easy. He said, we didn't use it. I said, you didn't use it? I said, I don't understand. He said, we never use it. I said, oh, come on. You know, it must cost you $3 to $4 million to prepare that damn thing in manpower. What do you mean you don't use it? He said, you don't understand. I said, I know I don't. You know, please help me. He looked at me for a moment thoughtfully, and he smiled. He said, hey, He said, when you went to high school, did you have to study Latin? Well, that seemed like an oddball question. I said, sure. He said, how many years? I said, 4. He said, did you ever wonder why you had to study it? I said, of course I did. He said, did you ever ask the teacher? I said, sure. What'd she say? He said. I said, she told me it was good for me. He said, right. He said, that's good for me. Now, at the time, I thought that that was really incredibly stupid. It took me a long time to realize what a genius that guy was, because he knew something I didn't know. He knew that if they had used that plan, it would have destroyed the corporation. Of course, that leaves open the question why they did it, but the fact is, it was a destructive process if they had followed through. Why? Well, there are 2 reasons. One obvious, and one not at all, but it will be to you now that you're educated. The first is that this planning is directed at getting rid of what you don't want, right? It's directed at the removal of deficiencies. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, as the case may be, when you get rid of what you don't want, you do not necessarily get what you do want. Now, the easiest way I know to demonstrate this is to go up to a room that has a television set and turn it on. What's the probability you will get a program you want? I have calculated this very carefully over the years, and it's 0.01. 1 out of 100 times I will get a program I want. Now, it's very easy to get rid of. All I have to do is turn the channel. What's the probability I will get a program I want? 101. In fact, I've got a 50-50 chance of getting something I want even less. First principle of effective management. Effective management must be directed at getting what you do want, not at getting rid of what you don't want, because they are not equivalent things. Now we'll see the implications of that as we move along. The second deficiency is a lot more critical, and just 4 or 5 hours ago you wouldn't know what the hell I was talking about, but now you really are in a good position. Remember we started off by describing how the old man got us started? Right here. When he worked his way down to Joe, what was he doing? What was he doing to the corporation? Don't you see? First step of analysis. He was taking the whole apart. Exactly. He kept taking it apart until he hit the element, right? What happens to a corporation, which is a system, or a government agency, which is a system, when you take it apart? It loses all of its essential properties. The second step of this planning process is each part prepares a plan for itself taken separately. What happens? It loses all of its essential properties. And therefore, this kind of planning never addresses the essential opportunities or problems of the organization taken as a whole or any of its parts. It's irrelevant. It can't help the organization for that reason, because it's non-systemically oriented. Let me tell you one of the most important things we know about a system. We can prove this rigorously, but it's a very complicated technical proof. But nevertheless, it's easy to grasp by example. If you take any system, take it apart, and then arrange to have each part operate as efficiently as it possibly can, you know something about the system as a whole. You want to guess what it is? The system as a whole cannot be operating as efficiently as possible. When you maximize the efficiency of each part taken separately, you cannot have the whole operating at optimal efficiency. Why not? Well, that's what we can prove. But let me give you an example. Incidental intelligence. This is for your trivial pursuits. I don't know whether it's any longer true, but a couple years ago I read in the New York Times that there are 142 makes of automobile available in the United States. I like that number, so I'm going to have you engage with me in what Galileo called a thought experiment. It's an experiment so simple we can do it in our heads. Let's buy one of each of the 142 automobiles, bring them into a big garage. You with me? Now we go out and hire 50 of the best automotive engineers in the United States. We give them the following job. Tell us which one of these cars has the best carburetor. Well, they go off, this is great fun. And they come back sometime later and say the Mercedes has the best carburetor. So we make a note, carburetor, Mercedes. Say, okay, now take the transmission and do the same thing. They run off and they come back, say Lincoln's got the best transmission. So we make a note, transmission, Lincoln. Take the distributor. They come back and say the Volkswagen's got the best distributor. One by one, we take every part required for an automobile and they tell us the best one available. Okay, you got the picture? Now we take the composite list and give it back to them. And say, take the carburetor off the Mercedes, the transmission off the Lincoln, and so on down this list and put it together into the best possible automobile. We're going to have all the best parts. And the simple fact is we don't even get an automobile. Not only do we not get a good one, we don't even get an automobile. The reason's perfectly clear. Why? Parts don't fit. The performance of a system is never the sum of the performance of its parts. It is the product of their interactions. Effective management must be the management of the interactions of units, not the actions of units. This type of planning is planning the actions of units, never the interactions. What kinds of organizations tend to be reactive in their culture? Well, the ones that blew it some years ago. They failed to make an important technological change. The steel industry, which failed to see what the oxygen furnace was about. Other industries, which failed to see the value of automation. The railroads, which didn't see the value of the diesel until it was much too late and they'd been overtaken by the truck. These industries in general tend to project their failure onto the environment, and invariably it's some technological change that's occurred in the environment. I've had the chance to work in 7 railroads over my lifetime. It's marvelous because I know the solution to the problem before I begin. I don't even have to know what the problem is. I know what the solve is. The railroad is a system of solutions looking for problems to apply them to. Every damn time I work on a problem in the railroad, somebody will come up to me and say, we know how to take care of that. I don't know what you're doing. I say, how would you do it? One of 2 answers. Either eliminate trucks or the Interstate Commerce Commission. Typically reactive. You see, the railroads were once the largest corporations in the United States. What the hell happened to change it? They said trucks and regulation. Get rid of trucks and regulation, we'll be back where we were. That's typically reactive, whether true or not. And there's plenty of evidence to indicate that it isn't true. The reactive manager is like a man who goes swimming in the ocean that gets caught in a tide that carries him away from the shore. He turns around and desperately tries to swim against the tide to get back to the shore from which he came. Okay? So much for the reactive. You got any questions about him? Do you recognize him? All right, let's take the second type, inactive. The inactive manager doesn't want to go back to a previous state, but he does agree with the reactive that things are getting worse. What he wants to do is keep things like they are. If you think politically, he's reactionary and he's conservative. He wants to keep things like they are. They may not be perfect, but they're as good as we have any right to expect. So for God's sake, keep your damn hands off, let them alone, so things will not change. What he wants to do is prevent change. His basic doctrine is, if we didn't do anything, nothing would happen. And if nothing happened, that'd be marvelous. Because we like things the way they are. The patron saint of inactive managers is a great German philosopher of the late Renaissance, Leibniz. Leibniz is the one who proved that the world is the best possible world. Now, you might be interested in the proof, so I'll share it with you. Went as follows. Leibniz said in order to conduct any discussion, we have to have an agreed-upon definition of critical terms. He said the most important term in the discussion I want to have with you is God. He said, by God, I mean a perfect being. He said, if you accept that, we can go ahead. Well, that's easy to accept. He said, now imagine two gods, alike in every respect except one exists and one doesn't. Which of the two gods would be the more perfect? He said, clearly the one that exists. But since God is by definition perfect, therefore God must exist. That's the first part of his proof. You like that? That's nothing. What do you hear the second part? Imagine two gods, each of whom have created a universe. One universe is perfect and one is imperfect. Which of the two gods would be the more perfect? The one that created the perfect universe, right? Therefore, since God is by definition perfect, the universe must be. Isn't that neat? Well, Voltaire thought it was a scream. So he wrote a satire, which many of you read, but may not have been aware of, Candide. Candide is a satire on Leibniz. Candide is the story of a young man and his tutor. Candide is a young man, and his tutor is an old professor, Pangloss, who's a Leibnizian. And as they travel around the world trying to educate Candide, they incur one catastrophe after another. But since poor old Pangloss believes this is the best of possible world, he has the problem of rationalizing the catastrophes, and that's where the humor of the book comes out. So, for example, he loses his left arm in an accident. He said, oh, what the hell, I'm right-handed anyhow. So furthermore, I can now get suits with only one sleeve, and they will cost less. If he later loses his right arm, it turns out he didn't like to write anyhow, and he hates letters. And all the humor of the book comes out of the effort to support the belief that this is the best of possible worlds. Now, contemporary and activists don't believe this is the best of possible worlds, but they believe it's good enough and ought to be left alone. Just this week, driving into work one morning, one of the low-grade intellectual disc jockeys that I happen to be listening to quoted J. Phillips Oppenheimer, whom I'm sure you all know, the head of the Manhattan Project. The most incredible quote. I just have been absolutely smiling to myself ever since. J. Phillips Oppenheimer said that an optimist is a person who thinks that this may be the best of possible worlds. And a pessimist is one who knows that it is. Isn't that marvelous? God, I love that. Just great. Okay. These people then try to do nothing. Unfortunately, they can't succeed. Why? Because not everybody is inactive. It's all you people out there that are trying to improve things are mucking it up. If you just keep your damn hands off, things would be fine, but you're screwing it up in your efforts to improve things. What do? Nothing until I have to. Well, when do I have to? When what you've done threatens my survival or stability. Then and only then will I react. Now, what do you call a situation in which your survival or stability is threatened? It's a what? Crisis, right. Inactive managers practice crisis management. Crisis management is their style. Now, crisis management goes under a number of different titles. In the State Department, it was called brinksmanship by John Foster Dulles. The English typically have a more exotic term. They call it muddling through. If you're a professor, you don't use any of those words because students would understand you. So we use a terminology given to us by the principal spokesman of inactive management, who are two political scientists, eminent ones, Hirschman and Lindblom. And the doctrine is called disjointed incrementalism. Isn't that beautiful? Disjointed, what does that mean? You act only when you have to, not in accordance with any plan, only under emergencies. Incrementalism means you do as little as you can possibly get away with, no more than you have to. You don't try to solve the problem, you try to turn off the heat. If you got a racial crisis, as we did in the 60s, the administration didn't try to solve the race problem, it tried to stop the rioting. So that what you're trying to do is remove the symptoms, so you're not going after the cause the way the reactive is. Well, be that as it may, with the increasing number of crises due to accelerating change, the inactive manager is far from inactive. He's coping with crises day after day, but even if he wasn't, he'd be busy as hell. The reason he'd be busy as hell is it takes a hell of a lot of work to keep people busy doing nothing. It just doesn't happen naturally. See, people have this terrible inclination to do something, and you can't stop it. But what you have to do is allow them to do something that has no effect. And that's hard. We have succeeded, however, I'm happy to say, by first inventing a type of organization which is dedicated to occupying people doing nothing, and then a process to engage them in it. The type of organization is called a what? Well, it's a synonym for it. It's called a bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is an organization whose primary purpose is to keep people busy doing nothing. Now, it makes all kinds of other declarations, but believe me, that's what it is. The process that it employs is called red tape. Now, it's easy to see. Let me just take a simple example. I live in the state of Pennsylvania. We have to get our car inspected twice a year. And we get our license every 2 years, and it's very simple. To get my license, this is all I have to do. I receive from the state an envelope, and in the envelope there's a pre-punched IBM card and a self-addressed return envelope. I check the entry in the IBM card, sign the card, make out a check, take the check and the card, put it in the envelope and seal it, put a stamp on it and mail it. 15 minutes. And a week later I received my license. Very easy. Now, I lived in Mexico in '76. And in Mexico you have to renew your license every 6 months. So the first thing to observe is 4 times as often. Every time I renewed my license, I had to fill out a 3.5-page form, which you could not get by mail. I had to go to a government office to get it. Having gotten it and filled it out, of course in Spanish, which I couldn't speak, I then had to get 16 endorsements. It took me an average of 2.5 days to do it every time I renewed my license. Now, at the end of that, I got a little card which said I was authorized to drive a car. Exactly what I get from the state of Pennsylvania. What was the difference? Output was identical. The difference is the number of people kept busy. What were they busy doing? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The output's identical. That's what bureaucracy is about. It's bad enough that these people do nothing. The real problem is they find ways of obstructing the people who have something to do. Because I was busy trying to do something, and I had to waste 2.5 days doing nothing. The worst I've ever seen is I happened to have a trip to the Middle East in the 70s, and my first stop was in Turkey. I was at Ankara, and one of my former students was my host. He was the head of science and technology for the Turkish government, and he insisted on showing me the new buildings of the University of Ankara. So we went off to take a tour of buildings. And they were very proud of the fact that the new building had automatic elevators in, the first that they had in Turkey at the time. And they were what turned out to be Westinghouse elevators. So he wanted me to take a ride in them. This was going to be a great novelty. So we got into the elevator, and there was a little girl in a uniform who asked us what floor we wanted to go to, and she pushed the button for us. What was she doing there? You know, what the hell's the point of an automatic elevator if you got an operator? I turned to him and I said, my God, you know, what a hell of a way to create employment. It's a real bankruptcy of the human being that he can't find a productive way to use people. He got to waste them doing this. And I went on, gave a long lecture, and if I had known what was going to happen a week later, I would have shut up. Because a week later, I was in Iran, in Tehran. And they wanted to show me a new building that had been built there. We went and lo and behold, they had Westinghouse automatic elevators, and they insisted on taking me for a ride. In the elevator was a pretty little girl in a uniform who pushed the buttons for you. And out in the hall was a pretty little boy in a uniform who asked you if you wanted to go up or down and push that button for you. Isn't that awful? What were they doing? Absolutely nothing. That's what an active manager are engaged in, keeping people busy doing nothing. Now, what kind of an organization can survive doing nothing? That's the important question. Only those whose survival is independent of their performance. What kind of organizations can survive independently of their performance? The answer is easy. Subsidized organizations. Now, when I say that, of course, the first thing everybody thinks of is government. That's true. Government is overwhelmingly inactive for perfectly obvious reasons. It's hard to have a better life than to get well paid for doing nothing. Very little pressure on you except to look busy. And that's fairly easy after a while. But government isn't the only culprit. Every corporation is full of it. You know, some of you were saying to me, God, you know, and a corporation must be great. They're driven by profit. That's true. The corporation is. But the personnel department isn't. It doesn't have any P&L statement. The advertising department isn't. The research and development department isn't. The external affairs isn't. They are subsidized bureaucracies with no measure of performance applied to them, and they're busy making work. I just engaged in a study with a major corporation in this country. And we went from 850 in corporate headquarters to 72. And for the first time in 15 years, it's working well. We got rid of all those damn obstructions. We didn't fire all those people. We got rid of them in other ways. Shot a few here and there. But now it's working well. Because everybody that's there has got something to do that needs to be done. Corporations are full of it. But lest you think I'm prejudiced, let me admit, shamefacedly, that the absolute epitome of inactivity is the American university. No question about it. The university is raised with an absolute fine art, the capacity to occupy large numbers of people doing nothing. They do it by perpetuating the myth that they educate their students. That's absolute nonsense. Any one of you ever went to a university know that you forgot 99% of what was told you there. Now, you learned a hell of a lot while you were at the university, but not because of the university, despite it. You learned a lot, but not in class. The university, it's incredible. You know what a full load is considered to be in a major university in the United States? You teach 6 hours a week. We are the highest paid people in the United States per hour of work. Not the highest paid people, but per hour of work. It's just unbelievable. Can you imagine grown men going in and giving twice a week a course that they've given each week for the last 30 years, and that's called a full-time job? The president of my university, in a recent faculty meeting, in a rare moment of candor and perception, said to the faculty, "Gentlemen, do you realize that this place is as hard to change as a cemetery?" And I was sitting in the audience and I couldn't resist. I said, "And do you realize that the reasons are exactly the same?" Universities haven't changed significantly since the 12th century when they were created. Only been superficial changes. You can't change a university. It's absolutely resistant to any effort to change it. The myth that universities are run to educate students, just nonsense. It's perfectly clear what a university is run for. It's to provide the faculty with the quality of work life that they want. You can't understand a university unless you understand that. Because nothing makes sense if you think it's trying to educate students. Now we're going to come back to that later. Okay, the inactive is caught in the tide, carrying him away from the shore. What does he do? He looks around and says, "Hey, I like it here." He tries to throw out an anchor and hold a fixed position in the moving tide. Okay? Now we come to the epitome of American management, the dominant kind. By the way, about 25% inactive, 25% reactive. The dominant type is pre-active, and it's much more dominant than that because it's the only kind of management that most business schools teach. It's the official management doctrine in the United States, the kind we exported all over the world when they thought we were good. We're about to run out of time, so we're going to have to stop acting for a little bit. Take a stretch.